It began as a military operation. Now, though, it's a massive onslaught on the well-being, indeed the lives of countless innocent civilians. Residential areas have been razed to the ground, many people killed in their own homes, families divided, hundreds of thousands of mostly women and children forced to leave the country. How many will never return, it's impossible to say, and the worst could still be yet to come. So, on another special edition of To The Point, we ask, Putin's war, no mercy for civilians? Thank you very much for joining us, and my guests here in the studio and in Bonn are Jessica Berlin, who has a German-American background and is a security and geopolitics expert. Also with us is Maximilian Popp from the influential German news weekly Spiegel, and a warm welcome too to Mikhail Bashuyev from DW's Russian department, who joins us, as I said, from Bonn. Thank you all three for being with me here today. And I'd like to begin with you, Jessica. This is an increasingly ugly war. Can there be any doubt that this is now going to have a huge impact on the whole of the European continent?
Well, this is the worst humanitarian crisis we have seen on this continent since World War II. We've had already, just in the last less than 2 weeks, over 2 million Ukrainians have fled the country.
It's a nightmare staggering number, and it's an unbelievable number.
It's truly cannot be overstated, the impact of this crisis.
OK. Let's listen in, before we really get going, to how Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been responding to the latest developments.
We will not forgive the shooting of unarmed people, the destruction of our infrastructure. We won't forgive hundreds and hundreds of victims, thousands and thousands of sufferings. And God won't forgive. Not today, not tomorrow, never.
Maximilian Popp, that was a very angry outburst there by the Ukrainian president. You've spent a lot of time out in the field as a reporter. Compare what we're seeing now in Ukraine with anything that you've seen in the past.
I have no comparison.
You have no comparison?
I have no comparison, as Jessica said. I mean, this is unmatched in recent history, and what I'm afraid is the worst is yet to come. I mean, we are seeing that the shelling has started. Yeah. And it's just going to intensify. The more Putin gets under pressure, the worse the war gets for him. And they are moving slow at the moment. The more I think he will upscale the attacks. So yeah, I'm very worried.
OK, well, as a result of the fighting, huge numbers of people have left the country, many heading initially for Poland, which is Ukraine's immediate neighbour. It's already clear that more will follow, the majority of them women and children.
We are going to look for work, because I need to provide for my children, and my husband stayed to defend his country.
It's dangerous there. People are shooting. I have a child. Fighter jets are flying around, houses are exploding. It's terrible, so frightening.
We didn't want to leave. It was so painful, but we did it because of the children. I didn't want to leave Ukraine. We love our country. We have such a beautiful country, great people. It hurts so much.
It's so hard. My heart is still there. It's so hard to see that children are being bombed every day. We just want peace. The children want peace.
Shocking statements there. Jessica, as I was listening to what we were hearing, I was writing down fear, desperation, pain, hopelessness. And I know that you have been down to the central station here in Berlin and collected your own first-hand impressions of what's going on. Give us those impressions.
Yes. Well, right now, the lower levels of Berlin Central Station has basically been turned into a crisis response center. Every day, over 12,000 Ukrainian refugees are arriving in Berlin Hauptbahnhof, and they are unloaded from the trains, and there are basically hundreds of volunteers who are distributing food and water, also arranging housing. A Ukrainian couple from Kharkiv is now staying in the little workroom in my flat with my husband and me, and it's just really, it's heartrending. The despair, the exhaustion, the fear, the disorientation of these people.
This is not what they would have expected. This is not what was going to happen next in their lives.
Of course not. Just like for any Syrians or Afghans or people fleeing violence anywhere else in the world in the past years, I think this is the great shock in Europe. For so long, we have thought, this doesn't happen here anymore. After World War II, we learned our lesson. And, that in the Balkans, well, that was the Balkans. But we here in Northern Europe, this doesn't happen here. And what this crisis, I hope, is driving home to everyone in Europe now, war is never that far away, and war in Europe is not that long ago.
And let me just pick up on one point that I mentioned, that most of the people who are on the move here are women and children.
Yes.
That's been much talked about. What are your impressions about what that signifies?
Well, the basic answer for that is that men from the age of 18 to 60 are now legally barred from leaving Ukraine in case they need to be drafted to serve in the Ukrainian army. Many men of all ages have already signed up. Others are supporting in logistics and humanitarian relief on the ground in Ukraine. But they're all basically in readiness, waiting for potentially being drafted.
Maximilian, the EU says it will effectively take in all refugees fleeing the war in Ukraine. Do you think it can cope? Do you think Germany can cope?
Well, it's a remarkable step, given how the policy has been in recent years. I mean, we had a comparable situation in 2015, when many Syrians were escaping to Europe, and there was a huge outcry, especially from the right, mass demonstrations against refugees and so on.
It's all different now, isn't it? It's all different.
Now it's like this new welcoming culture, even in countries like Poland and Hungary. Let me say, I think that's great. It's necessary, and it's an act of solidarity. I wish it would be similar, it would be the same, and it should be the same to people fleeing from, you mentioned it, Afghanistan, Syria. I mean, think back last November, when people were at the Belarusian-Polish border. What happened there? I mean, they were tear gassed. Yeah. They were kept out in the cold, freezing in the forest. So there's some discrepancy here, which I personally find a bit distressing. But the solidarity that is shown now is remarkable. And what is important is to build up on that. And don't do the same mistakes like in 2015, when you were like letting people in but didn't provide the necessary infrastructure. Yeah. So that is what has to happen now, fast, have the infrastructure, get them into the labor market, help with the integration, and prepare for them to stay longer. Don't expect that they will go back like in a month or two, because I don't think that's a realistic scenario.
Okay, an important message. Let's go to Mikhail in Bonn. Just thanks for waiting. I'd just like to begin with your person here a little bit, your background, Mikhail. You were born in Russia, but actually quite close to the border with Ukraine, and I know that's important for you, that proximity. Now you're sitting where you are in Bonn, we're here in Berlin, and you're witnessing the biggest movement, the biggest exodus from a country since World War II. What's your reaction?
Well, first of all, my heart is broken, and I'm trying not to get too personal or too emotional on this, but what we see is two tragedies. The primary tragedy is the war that's happening in the Ukraine, driven by the invasion of Russian military forces. It's unbelievable, and it was unthinkable until last November, and then much of us saw it coming and could not prevent it coming. But my heart is obviously also with the secondary tragedy, which is unfolding collapse of Russian economy, Russian society, disintegration of the Russian society as well.
That's interesting that you say that, because that was precisely my next question. That this is, everybody's focusing on Ukraine, rightly so. This is where, the awful things in the main are happening at this point in time. But two countries, Ukraine and Russia, face terrible times, or difficult, very, very difficult times ahead, including Russia.
Absolutely. We have to focus on the situation in Ukraine and help refugees coming from there. But also, we have to think 2 steps ahead. And these 2 steps are really disintegrating in a really fast fashion, disintegration of Russia with the global order. We had jokes in Russia that, some measures by Kremlin are greatly doing a North Korea of sorts out of Russia. But no, it's not a metaphor. It's not a joke. Russia is cutting so many routes and so many connections to the outer world. It's something that we have to have in mind, how to live with a huge country that is hostile, basically, and that can inflict much pain, not only on the neighbouring country.
Okay, thank you very much for that perspective there, Michael, from Bonn, the former German capital. Jessica, you are also a geopolitical expert, as I mentioned, and I'd just like to bring up some images of the destruction that's been taking place in the Ukraine. And while we're looking at those images, I wonder whether you could tell us whether you think that, Ukraine can win its battle or can survive its battle for freedom. Jessica.
So it's not an Einspieler. Well, what we're seeing in Ukraine right now, this is only the beginning, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It's been not even 2 weeks since the invasion started. And whether or not Ukraine can survive, can hold out against the Russian military and the increasing use of indiscriminate bombing and artillery, as Vladimir Putin, as we were discussing earlier, has been increasingly pressured and pushed into a corner. His original strategy for this invasion has failed. That's clear. And now he is going to be more desperate. He's going to use more firepower because he cannot afford, in his view, to lose or to be seen as having lost. So the only way Ukraine will survive this is with increased support, military support from the West, air support, or the contribution at the very least of jets, of fighter planes to Ukraine for Ukrainian pilots to pilot if the West is not willing to take that step. And above all, we need to stop financing the war for Russia with our oil and gas imports here in Europe, and in particular here in Germany. And just yesterday, Olaf Scholz announced and made very clear the German Chancellor Scholz has made very clear that he's not willing to take that step, that we're too dependent on Russian energy. But the cost of letting this war continue and of financing Russia's war on Ukraine through our energy purchases is going to be much higher than any cost of cutting off Russian oil and gas imports.
Absolutely, there's so much.
I can only support Jessica, if I may, Peter, if I may support Jessica and say, let's think about what Jessica said in a kind of game theory. I think the West should gamble with cut of oil and gas imports from Russia, as long as we, the West is having much more resources to hold out, while Russia is not. So the Russia cannot afford to. Russia hasn't got that much time. And we have to have this in mind.
Maximilian?
The time is on the Ukrainian and Western side. That's the point.
I partly agree. I wanted to add one thing. If we remember what Putin has been doing already in Syria, where the Russian Air Force was flying deliberate attacks against schools, against hospitals, then re-attacking people who rush to help. And I'm very much concerned that he's going to repeat a very similar tragedy now in Ukraine, cities like Kiev.
Exactly.
So I think before the war ends, I'm afraid it's getting much more brutal.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah. We've seen it before, what he did in Chechnya, what he did in Syria. He'll do it again in Ukraine. I have no doubt.
We're talking about...
We have to get proactive, you know. That's what I'm talking about. We have to get proactive in this confrontation. I mean, the West.
We have to get proactive, we have to intervene, we have to save lives, but at the same time, you know, it's not easy to say that by any manner of means. Nothing is easy.
Well, it's easy to say, but hard to do.
But that's the point. I mean, then the other side will say, but this could lead to World War III.
We are already at a tipping point risking World War III. Now, our action and our inaction...
I don't want to believe what you're saying.
Well, neither do I. But unfortunately, as a student of history and as a geopolitical expert, we are truly at a tipping point. Vladimir Putin, ultimately, and the elites around him, the oligarchs and the security elites surrounding the Kremlin, they have the most power right now to save this situation. But if they do not act, if they are not able to neutralize the threat to world peace that Vladimir Putin currently presents, and we cannot count on them to do that. We cannot assume that they're going to fix this themselves. Then the West does need to act. Vladimir Putin has already said he considers Western sanctions, the extreme sanctions that we've put through, he considers this an act of war. He's already using the language to give him an excuse to attack NATO. And so it brings me no pleasure to say that we already stand potentially on the brink of a devastating war within Europe that would have vast consequences around the world, thus a potential World War III. This is not melodrama. Unfortunately, this is the risk we face.
So, one cornerstone of what you're saying really is, I mean, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian leader, came out and said, if Ukraine does not survive, the whole of Europe will not survive. So Ukraine cannot lose this war.
Well, to some extent, yes, Ukraine is fighting for Europe in general.
Yeah.
And but the thing is, I would be very cautious. I very much support that the West, the European countries, the US, are supporting Ukraine as much as they can, sending weapons, having heavy sanctions, especially against Putin and his regime, not against Russia and its people, because I want to say one thing, this is Putin's war, not Russia's war, and I think it's very important to make this distinction. So we should be very supportive to Ukraine, but I would be very cautious for the NATO to get involved in this. So if we discuss, for example, about a no-fly zone, I think that is a very dangerous thing. Because yes, we are in a very problematic confrontation already with Russia, but we are not in a third world war yet. And that has to be prevented. A nuclear war has to be prevented. And any direct involvement of NATO, I think, could easily trigger things that then get out of control very fast. So I would say everything short to war, but not entering the war as NATO directly.
We're talking about a dreadful... Mikhail?
Oh, Peter, I would like to add something to what Maximilian said. And I agree with him that the no-fly zone over Ukraine is potentially provoking. But cutting off oil and gas imports is actually not in military terms. So it's a better option. It costs us more in the short term, but it would bring us more in the long term.
Jessica.
Agreed. This is a very simple and clear action we could do that would cut off financing to Russia's war. And I also agree with Maximilian.
Germany is so very, very vulnerable there.
If we're not ready to pay higher energy prices here at home to protect freedom in Europe,
Germany has made itself absurdly
we will lose freedom in Europe.
If
we are not willing, if we're not willing to pay more for our energy costs and consumption to defend peace in Europe, then we will lose peace in Europe. We can't have it both ways. And the German government needs to have this conversation with the German people and make the people understand, who have lived for decades now in peace and prosperity. We need to have this conversation with the German people. We need to understand that Ukraine's freedom is our freedom.
Shocking things are happening. Dreadful deeds are plenty. One question perhaps that arises is the question of accountability. And Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, has been making clear that the world is keeping a very firm eye on what Russian forces are doing and what consequences there might be.
We've certainly seen in the past that one of Russia's methods of war is to be absolutely brutal. We're looking very closely at what's happening in Ukraine right now, including what's happening to civilians. We're taking account of it, we're documenting it, and we want to ensure, among other things, that there's accountability for it.
Mikhail, what can you tell us, I'm not sure, about the growing sense in Russia, perhaps, that there might be accountability, there might be a day of reckoning that lies ahead, and that the price might be very high for people in Russia, especially military commanders?
Well, this message is not spread over Russia, so let's be very skeptical about that. I mean, we have to realize and to spread the word about how effective Russia has been on domestic front. We saw that basically Ukraine won this info war, and that Putin miscalculated his military operation. But what we underestimated or overestimated is how people in Russia would oppose this war. I mean, in the narrative, in Russia, there is no war. Many people still don't know.
I would have to say, sorry to interrupt, but the word that comes to mind for me is that people in Russia, many people, are in denial, and there's more denial with every day that passes.
Absolutely, people don't believe the news coming from their relatives in Ukraine, living there and telling about sheltering and bombing, etc. They just don't believe. They believe what they're told in the Russian state-run media.
Okay.
And there is either no war or only bombing of military infrastructure, etc. So a lot of myths and lies spread, and this narrative is really effective. This must be recognized here. So the Russian population will get this information eventually.
Let's hear what Jessica has to say on this one. Are members of the Russian forces, senior commanders, likely to be brought to justice at some stage? Is that a realistic possibility?
I think it's highly unlikely. International justice moves very slowly, even the best of terms. And even if they're indicted in absentia, the likelihood that they would actually be able to be brought to physically stand trial is unlikely. But frankly, at this point, worrying about the accountability in the long-term future for the crimes of today, while they're still ongoing, must be a secondary thought. Mm-hmm. The first priority and focus must be ending this war. This aggression started in Moscow, and the quickest way to end it also must come from Moscow. The Russian people protesting and the elites around the Kremlin intervening behind closed doors to find a negotiated ceasefire and solution. They can keep some billions in exchange for stopping this war. And those discussions are going on as we speak. Let's see what happens.
What's your take? Who or what can stop Vladimir Putin at this stage?
Well, let me add that I agree. I still think it has a symbolic meaning, because we finally are calling Putin what he is, a war criminal. He has been a war criminal in Syria, and he's a war criminal now, and it's important to name it. I agree. I think international justice is slow and conflicted. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, I find it important that Blinken and others are bringing it up. What ends the war? At this point, I don't have a real answer. I don't see that.
The wise voices suggest that it would be possibly the Chinese who might be most likely to have somehow influence when they whisper in Vladimir Putin's ear.
Some say so, others say Erdogan. I think that shows how desperate the situation is. I don't see like a huge Chinese interest to get very much involved in that. It's not their war. So I don't have high hopes there. I don't see that the point for negotiations has arrived already. I mean, if this war goes on, maybe Putin reaches a point where he says, I have to end it one way or the other and start negotiating. But, I mean, the price for that is super high. I mean, I think he expected that he would, like, go in and within a week, Kiev would have been fallen, Zelensky would have been out, and he would have taken over. It went another way, and everything now is super unpredictable.
Super unpredictable. The nightmare goes on, I'm afraid. Putin's war, no mercy for civilians. That's what we've been discussing on To The Point this time round. Thanks very much for joining us. I hope we've given you some food for thought in these difficult times. For now, bye-bye and tschüss.